Well, welcome to the 8th meeting of the Toronto branch of the Greater Church of Lucifer. Thank you everybody for showing up. It's quite a big crowd for such short notice. Thank you everybody for showing up. So today, I'm going to give a talk on true will and what that means in Thelema, which is where the term is popularized, and how it differs from how we use the term in Luciferianism and in the left-hand path in general. And then we can have a group discussion about it as well. And then after that, Sean is going to be giving a talk on meditation, and then actually doing a guided meditation, something to do with chakra balancing. And then if we have time, then we can have group discussion after that as well. So I guess might as well get right into it. So true will. This is a term that was popularized by Aleister Crowley, who was the founder of Thelema, is the religion of Thelema. He considered himself the prophet of Thelema, and the word Thelema is actually Greek for will, and it doesn't just mean whatever you desire. That's not the meaning of true will in this sense. Will is more like the Eastern meaning of the word dharma, which is kind of like your purpose or the work that you're kind of intended to do, your place in the machine in a sense. So what they say in that tradition is your true will is kind of like your own individual part of the universal will. So the universe as a whole kind of has its own kind of momentum and a direction it's kind of moving in. Everything has a place within that, and your individual true will is when you've aligned yourself to that universal will, then you're following your true will. So it's a very right-hand path way of looking at things. And that's definitely not what we mean in the left-hand path, because in the left-hand path, we kind of, we're not bound by what nature or the universe has in mind for us. So just to further elaborate on that, what Crowley says is that if you are truly following your true will, and if everyone else is following their true will, then nobody is going to be trampling on anybody else's will, in a sense. So everything would be in harmony if everyone was following their genuine true will. So really, this is kind of it's a very right-hand pathway of looking at it, because you're kind of giving up your own individual desires, your own individual whatever you wanted out of life, and subsuming it into the universal will, and saying, okay, well, this is what I'm here for. This is what the universe has planned for me, so I'm going to do that. You know. It reminds me of in the Bhagavad Gita, Arjuna actually is fighting against his true will in that story, where he doesn't want to fight against his brother. But Krishna says, no, it's your dharma, it's your purpose, to have this fight, to war against your brother, and so it's your duty. There's a sense of duty, and so finally he did end up saying, okay, I'm gonna, put aside my individual ego and my own personal desires and follow the course that the universe has set for me. And it's essentially identical to Crowley's version of true will. The other thing is that in Thelema, what they say is that you work at these different occult practices, meditation, yoga, of various different techniques that you develop and skills that you develop, and eventually it leads up to knowledge and conversation of the holy guardian angel. That is like the adept level of that system is when you attain knowledge and conversation of the holy guardian angel. Now, the holy guardian angel, there's a lot of, Crowley said different things about it at different times in his life and to different audiences, but generally it's thought of as kind of like what a lot of people refer to as their higher self or their higher genius. And this is a part of yourself, but some people think of it almost as a separate entity. But either way, you work hard at these different techniques, and eventually you develop communication with that part of yourself. And that part of yourself dictates to you what your true will is. It communicates that to you. And along the process, you do get these different pieces of insight and flashes of intuition about what it is, but as you get closer to it, it becomes more and more obvious and more clear and intense. So that's what it means in Thelema. Now, in the left-hand path and in Luciferianism, when we say true will, we're not talking about it in the same way. What we really mean is essentially what we've decided that we want to devote our lives to, the set of goals that we want to accomplish, and what type of a god you want to become. So within the left-hand path, the goal, the end goal, the ultimate end goal is apotheosis, or becoming divine, becoming a god in your own right, becoming a force of nature in your own right, and influencing the universal will, influencing the course of nature itself. And so it's not just a passive kind of accepting what role do I kind of fall into in this universal will. It's how do I want to make my mark on the world? How do I want to exert my will onto the world? How do I want to manifest my will in the world? And really, it's more of a choice. We do have certain, proclivities or certain predilections in our because of various nature and nurture. That because of the way that we were brought up, and the experiences that we've had. But there's something that really will motivate a person. That when you hit that, it's like you feel inspired and you feel energized, and it's your passion. And so what we do in the left hand path is we will decide what we're passionate about ourselves, and usually this involves the unique aspects of the self that we will kind of exalt and utilize, and how can we take our unique talents and do something amazing with them, do something in the world to affect it, to make a lasting change, to establish a legacy that will live on well past our physical bodies. And really, like I said, what it boils down to is what kind of a God do you want to become? And so when you think of what is this legacy that I want to leave, then you have certain goals that you want to achieve. And if you can get all the various aspects of yourself harmonized toward achieving these common goals, so you know how a lot of times we'll want something, but another part of us doesn't want that thing. You know, we'll be like, oh, I want to do this, but really, I don't want to do this. You know, and there's like people are, divided in themselves, and a lot of times, if it's something very, very important, it can really tear a person apart if they're that divided against themselves. And so one of the techniques that we can use in the left-hand path is to pick a goal and align all of the parts of ourselves toward accomplishing that goal. All the various fragments of the self, all the various different aspects of the self can all utilize their various unique qualities towards achieving these common goals, and that actually harmonizes us. What I like to call it is eventually you can develop a certain level of internal coherence, a certain level of personal integrity, where um, I like to call it the complete harmonized self. Whereas you have the idea of the higher self, and which implies a lower self, right? Um, I kind of don't like that terminology because it in itself divides uh, divides you. You know, it's another way of taking parts of yourself that you think are worthy or virtuous or valuable in whatever kind of system that you feel that this part of me is valuable, and the other parts of yourself would be the lower self, and the part it allows you to demonize parts of yourself. Even if on an unconscious level. If you're using that term higher self, you're setting up a split within yourself. You're saying, okay, well, that's the valuable part, and I got to get rid of this lower self, or subjugate this lower self, or it ends up repressing parts of yourself that you just didn't like anyways, right? Rather than trying to understand and integrate them into a complete whole, complete harmonized self. So, um, what I like to say is the complete harmonized self is like if you if you're not all harmonized, like you start out kind of like a candle or an incandescent light bulb, where the light is just kind of going everywhere in all directions. But once you've achieved the complete harmonized self, all of that light is focused intensely in one direction, in that same direction. And it's like a laser beam. You know? It's light still, but it can cut through solid metal, if it's intense enough and focused enough. You know, uh, a light bulb can't do that. Light coming off of a candle can't do that. But if you can get that coherence and direction, then you can do amazing things with what people think of as non-physical in the first place, light. So, um, in the Thelemic version of true will, it's more like you eliminate preference. You kind of you have all these different dualities within yourself, and you do eliminate that duality, but you're doing so in a way that um, it's eliminating preference really. Whereas in the left-hand path version, you're kind of accentuating that preference and focusing it toward achieving amazing things. So I guess that's the main difference between the Thelemic version of true will and the left-hand path usage of the term. Personally, I often don't use the word true will because it's so strongly associated with Thelema. I just refer to it as will, usually. Your individual will. Because it doesn't have that implication that you are accepting the will, the universal will, or your part in the universal will. You're forging your own path. And that's all I've got prepared. We can discuss it now.
I think what we're talking about here, like from neuroscience point of view, we call it cognitive dissonance. But that's a main characteristic of the human brain. It's like how you can just go and have one desire, one belief, focus on it without considering anything else. That's by itself, like as you say, you're going to be a god, or you're going to be like infinite energy or knowledge, which is how, as a human, I'm going to reach that point.
By aligning the various different aspects of yourself toward achieving these common goals is how it harmonizes it.
But let me ask another question. Is there an example of such person?
Of an individual that's achieved that?
Yeah.
Well, I think that there's a lot of people that achieve certain levels or a certain degree of that. I think that there are certain techniques that people will use to kind of program the less conscious aspects of themselves toward achieving these common goals. Um, you know, uh, Several years back, it was very popular for people to watch this movie or book called The Secret, and they had techniques, some basic techniques in there that actually help you achieve that. In occultism, we actually have a much wider toolkit to do that, to kind of reprogram the less conscious aspects of ourselves toward these common goals. So a lot of times people, even if it's a material goal, even if it's something that you want to achieve a certain position within, if you want to build a company, you want to start a business, and you want to develop it, build it up into something that's going to outlast you, outlive you, your legacy, right? Um, People will do these techniques where they'll have creative visualization, they'll program themselves with symbols, like if they'll make a collage, you know, and then they'll meditate on that collage. Occultism, people will make mandalas that represent their will, and they'll meditate on that, and that kind of imprints that in their deep self. Within in chaos magic, people will have a goal, and they'll create a sigil that represents that goal, and then they'll use techniques to enter into altered states or trance states, or um, in chaos magic, a lot of times they refer to it as a state of gnosis, which is a bit different usage than most people use the word gnosis for, but they'll enter into a state that is very suggestible, where they'll put themselves into a suggestible state, and then they'll fire off that sigil into their subconscious and let it grow as like a seed. And these and other techniques are used, even meditation are used to kind of allow the mind to enter into these extremely focused states. Um, and we can use all these different things in order to get like I said, the less conscious parts of yourself in line with the common goals. And there are people that have achieved amazing things because they've had such uh, strong focus, and they've managed to get so much of their own being, so much of their self invested in these common goals that it creates a certain coherence, and they're able to achieve amazing things. Happens all the time. On a more occult level, we can take various aspects of ourselves, like there's other techniques such as lucid dreaming, and in Tibetan Buddhism and Bon shamanism, there's this dreams of clear light, various different levels of consciousness that if you can maintain conscious awareness within, then you're kind of helping bridge the gap between the various different aspects of yourself as well. So, like when you're lucid dreaming, you've been able to bring conscious awareness into what's usually a less conscious state. And we can even bring that level of conscious awareness into non dreaming sleep, where there's no experience like we're having now, like a sensory type experience, but you still have that pure level of awareness within that non dream sleep. And that's a very high level of coherence within the self. But there's a lot of different ways we can approach it. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, just I hear about secrets a lot, and you hear about people talk about it. Just sometimes you don't see such person. Yeah, I know, for example, hardworking people who really believe that they can do something, and of course, yeah, you know, must through effort, through hard work, of course, they reach what they need. But that's how this they explain is that if what they're talking about is what they're doing unknowingly, or is that something that they're doing? So how you can distinct, or how you can define exactly the technique that you're talking about, it works, and someone have done it, and you can tell me, oh, there we go, this is exactly what you've done, this is was the first project or objective, and this is what you realize. How is that person? People they talk, and sometimes they go even emotional about it, it's like, it's, oh, you know what, it's not materialistic, it's spiritual, and you fix it in your subconscious, then you do it. But
Well, I think the key is actual goal setting and achieving these goals. And there are some very high level achieving people out there. They may or may not be using these techniques consciously. They may just they may already have a naturally coherent level, a certain level of coherence within themselves. They know what they want, and they know what they need to do to get it, and they work tirelessly towards it, and they achieve amazing things. There are all kinds of examples of these type of people. They may not be aware of what they're doing necessarily, but we can actually look at what we can actually, they can be interviewed, and we can see what they're doing. We can look at the things that they've done that are observable, and we can model that behavior, and then we can try it out ourselves. But yeah, there are lots of people that have been extremely highly achieving people, and they must have a certain level of coherence developed within themselves to even achieve those things. Or they're extremely lucky, but that doesn't account for everybody who's achieved amazing, great things.
I was going to just mention that a lot because also people when they are successful, people they would come to the room asking this question, how we have to justify it somehow. Nobody can tell you know what? Yeah, I just you know uh, inherited, for example, $10 million, and then I invested it, and I have now $100 million. No, you have to justify it somehow. You say, oh, I went through a struggle, this and this and that. But if someone who's not successful, ask this question, and of course you answer this question by this answer of I've been hard worker. I say, yeah, and you didn't realize anything. You know what I mean? So it depends on, we're always looking at the results. The results doesn't mean anything. You know what I mean? Like we see successful people, and we always assume, oh, you know what, they have coherence within themselves. But that's it. So,
Well, not necessarily. Like some people did just inherit a position and manage to, push it forward just a little bit. But it seems like they're very successful, and they are. But they've inherited that position. They didn't have to go very far, But there are a lot of people that started out with absolutely nothing and managed to achieve amazing things. It is about results. It is about results. You can't say that it's not about results because there's a lot of people that talk a big game, but where are the results? There's obviously something that's holding them back from achieving the things that they are always talking about. There's a part of themselves that's blocking it. Otherwise, they would have achieved it. Or they would have come, made steps toward achieving it. There would be results that you could observe. You know, there's some sort of roadblock that they've encountered within themselves. Of course, luck plays a role, but as occultists, there are, I think, part of magic is using lesser known techniques to increase the coincidences that occur in our lives, the opportunities that present themselves. But you have to be willing to take those opportunities when they show up. You know, Berto?
Yeah, yes, I'm not a little bit confused. Is there any relation between true will and free will?
I'm not sure what you mean. There's one extra wheel, three wheel. I don't know. I don't know what you
Yeah,
mean.
because of the religion, they preach about the free will.
Oh, free will.
we will.
Okay, sorry, I thought you said two wheel and three wheel. Yeah, free will, certainly. Um, if you are, if you've been heavily programmed by other people, and haven't challenged the things within yourself that when we're very young, we often just accept what we're told as truth. If it's from somebody who has a certain level of authority that we, presumed authority, even as adults, uh, if there's somebody in a position of authority that we've accepted that authority, when they say something or tell us something, oftentimes we'll just accept it without question, without challenging or researching on our own. By the time that we're adults, we've accumulated so many of these unquestioned assumptions, and really, it's that's not free will in a sense. You're just kind of you've accepted all the various different programming that has come from outside, and you're just kind of playing it out. You know, that isn't exactly free will. When you've challenged these assumptions and decided whether or not you're going to accept it, you know, it's a process where you have to go through and challenge all these different assumptions that you've made in your life and see which ones hold up, which ones hold water, and when they do, you keep it. When they don't, you toss it. And you should be willing to uh, not you should be willing to toss it when it doesn't work or when you come across information that proves that it's not right. That's a cognitive dissonance thing. When that cognitive dissonance that you feel is a learning opportunity. It's an opportunity to change your programming because you're experiencing when you've got a deeply held belief, and then you're confronted with conflicting data. Um, there's a point where you have to say, well, am I going to accept this conflicting data, which will perhaps shatter something that I've held as a deeply held belief? It can be a very painful process. It causes a level of stress on the individual. So a lot of people will avoid that. When they encounter a situation where they're experiencing cognitive dissonance, they'll often either just push away that new information and say, "Oh, must be bullshit," um, and they'll just move on. They'll say, "No, I choose to believe what I've been programmed to believe." um, or they'll come up with an elaborate. Sometimes people who have to logically understand something, they'll come up with a really twisted, roundabout way of justifying their original belief. You Another thing people will do is I think it's called information bias. So people will seek out information that reinforces the things that they already believe to be true, and then they're like, "Oh, yes, yes," and it's just further reinforcing whatever programming they've had. But if you seek out information that contradicts your beliefs as well, then it allows you a chance to for that belief to be challenged, and you could potentially grow and learn from that experience. But you got to be careful and do it gradually, because sometimes if it's too much of your deeply held beliefs are challenged too quickly and too intensely, it can be very stressful, and it can lead to it could be traumatic even, which and you'll develop a coping mechanism to deal with that, which suppresses stuff. And you don't want to force your mind to suppress stuff, because that has to be dug up later and dealt with, and it can be very painful.
So having said that, do you think that to get rid of the belief, you have to believe as something else?
Not necessarily. I think that oftentimes when a deeply held belief, or even just a casually held belief, that we've had, gets destroyed, or proven wrong, that we're faced with the truth that it's not true, or we're faced with the falsity of a belief that we've been holding. Um, Sometimes there isn't something that immediately fills that void, you know. And I think that the best thing is if you can abide within that state of unknowing, for as long as you can, because oftentimes whatever comes in to replace it just ends up being another form of programming, you know. And but that sense of not knowing, or that sense where you don't have something to replace it, can be very uncomfortable.
Exactly, because we need to be in control. That's human nature.
It's human nature to want to understand things and want to kind of have an answer for all these different things.
To control situations.
There's even a part of the brain called the reticular activating system, which will constantly be running in the background trying to answer unanswered questions. So it's even there's a function that's trying to fill those holes. But if you have a certain level of mental discipline developed through your practice, through meditation, through concentration, if you have that mental discipline, then you can abide within that state of unknowing for a longer period of time. You can uh, tolerate that discomfort for longer, and you can even kind of start to enjoy that feeling because it's very freeing. It allows you to act more spontaneously in the moment rather than react based off of stimulus reaction type thing, where most of the time uh, we encounter stimulus and then we react to that stimulus based off of our programming that we currently hold. But if we don't have that programming, if we've allowed that space to be empty, to be free, then we can act spontaneously in the moment with free will, with genuine free will. And we can choose in the moment what we feel is the best course of action to take. And we don't automatically just go. We can think about it for a minute. Whereas a lot of times, if 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 you're experiencing something and you immediately react to it, especially if you have a violent reaction to it, it's time to take a step back and wait and say, wait a minute, I'm reacting to this. There's something in me that's that's compelling me to react to that stimulus. You know, and that is a learning opportunity as well. You can observe yourself and say, okay, well, why am I reacting so strongly to this stimulus? And it can allow you to kind of dissolve that piece of programming in you that's caused that reaction. Um, Within a lot of Eastern traditions, the concept of karma isn't what most of the people think of, in the West. It's not like if you do good things and good things will happen to you. If you do bad things and bad things will happen to you. It's more like the programming that we've accepted and predilections, basically, when we have predilections set up in ourselves. Um, the ideal is not to accumulate a lot of positive karma. Um, the, the ideal is to neutralize all karma. So this karma is basically um, when something happens, it plants a seed in you, and then stimulus will you'll experience a stimulus which will cause that seed to sprout, right? And and then you're creating a cycle, right? When you allow that seed to sprout, then it sets up another seed, and then it just repeats. And then the more times you react in a certain way to a certain stimulus, the more likely you are to do it again in that way. You're creating program for yourself. But if you're able to abide in the moment and step back and observe yourself, observe these reactions in yourself without acting on them, allow them to they'll just dissolve. And then you become more free. Then the next time you experience that kind of stimulus, you're not going to be as likely to react to it. You can choose your actions a lot more freely. So yeah, there is a connection between um, free will and true will in that sense, because you can't without that free will, without developing that neutral karma, that neutral karma state, then you're just acting out your programming. You're just a cog in the machine. You're just a gear in the big machine of the universe. Playing out your role. We want to be able to kind of step out of that machine and kind of move the gears however we want in the moment.
I wish I knew so much more background, and I think that that's probably kind of bad for teaching here. I'm struck, I guess, not only reading the context, but how fundamentally different these two views of true will are. I mean, you depicted one sort of Epicurean, the other is Stoic, but one is universalistic and the other is individualistic. And the one celebrates individualism and idiosyncrasy, interested in going for it, and Thelema seems to be based on a sort of partially utopian idealism of Rousseau, where the individual and the collective will achieve a greater good for the greater number, almost like, like John Stuart Mill. And yet it means subsuming your individualism, accepting more of a predetermined role because the society is a greater good demands that. Anyway, it's just, I'm trying to construct this idea from this fascinating way, a beautiful way to explain it all. But it seems like a huge divergence between right path and left path. And I guess this is part of the dialogue and how Thelema and the Church of Lucifer differ on or overlap, where they overlap and where they differ.
Yeah, certainly. I think you seem to be doing really well with it.
Sorry to blabber on.
No. And I think that it's interesting because a lot of us were working on one set, for a period of time, and then we started doing another. I find that oftentimes most people will start out kind of from a right-hand path perspective, kind of almost a collectivist kind of viewpoint where you have a place in society and you kind of accept the teachings of the various institutions that you're raised with. And then at a certain point, you start to diverge and take on your own individuality. So usually most people start out right-hand path, just because of the way that we are, just human nature. We accept, we absorb, and oftentimes we become very fanatical about what we've absorbed. A sense of loyalty to these things that we randomly found ourselves in the situation. We didn't choose the conditions of our birth. Although I know there is a New Age teaching that does say that we did, but not consciously, anyways, right? Not in a very practical sense. We did, we absorbed all these things from the random coincidence of where we happen to be born, into what family we were born into, what religion we were raised with, and things like that. And I find that there is that kind of a tribal inherent sense within ourselves to be fiercely loyal to that up to a point. And then some people will stay that way forever, and that's fine. A lot of people find a lot of fulfillment in that. But some of us uh, have found it to be have hit a point. Usually there's a point that you hit where it all kind of breaks down and you rebel. And that's important too. We need people that are able to rebel against the status quo, and bring in new ideas, because otherwise uh, society would be completely stagnant.
Well, in this case, you mentioned, for example, the social pressure of the group thinking that we live in, which is, of course, it doesn't matter how strong you are, how liberal you think you're stuck with that. But then you say, okay, you have to choose. But we can then see this is another social reality that you're missing your original social, or another group thinking that you're missing.
Well, it does end up oftentimes becoming a new set of groupthink. It's a cycle, right? So sometimes it's up to the next generation to rebel against that new set of groupthink.
So where's the free will then?
The free will is in choosing your own path as an individual.
Within the new social reality.
Well, like I said about the ideas, when something breaks down that you like a belief that you've held, when you realize that it is false, oftentimes you'll just fill that with something else immediately. and then that becomes a new set of programming, right? But if you can abide within that with that unknowing for longer, then that's the real point of freedom right there. Because once you've accepted that new idea as true, then you kind of lock yourself down until that breaks down again, right? And then it's a cycle, right? So within ourselves, we have that cycle of having a certain status quo, parts of it get broken down, and then a new status quo develops, and then that sometimes gets broken down, and a new one, and that's on a microcosmic level. The same thing happens on a macrocosmic level with societies, you know. But that point in between, in Tibetan Buddhism they call it a bardo. That's the point where you can be liberated. Is in that bardo, that in between state. When you uh, let go of an old belief and haven't accepted a new one yet, that's the point of liberation.
Actually, seems like there's a lot of similarities between Polish and Thelema here, because through a lot of his writings, he emphasizes very much breaking social conventions and looking past what you can raise. Because I mean, the way I think of things and my thought process has changed depending on whether I have coffee or tea in the morning or water, just pure chemical reactions like that. And how I slept, how I'm feeling, what TV shows I watched recently, what books, and so on and so forth. Those are very much kind of base programming, I guess, that have to do with circumstances. And I mean, I don't really get a very Epicurean or John Stuart Mill asks, like, pleasure is the only good from Thelema. It seems much more about question a lot of what you're raised with as well. So I think there's a lot of commonality.
Well, I find that a lot of the same techniques are used in the right hand path and the left hand path, but not necessarily for the same reason, not necessarily to achieve the same end goal. For example, there's this Tibetan Buddhist practice where you have a begging bowl and you will just eat whatever you're given, right? And be grateful for whatever it is. And even if you feel like ideally I'd like to be a vegetarian, if somebody gives you meat, you eat it, right? And that is breaking down the preferences that you have, right? It's breaking down, the society, the rules. It's breaking the rules in a sense, right? Um, but it's done in a way that the purpose for it is to eliminate preference, to destroy the ego, really. Whereas when it's done from a left-hand path perspective, it's done to uh, build the ego the way that you want to build it, to build it up in a specific way. Does that make sense? So yeah, I find that there are a lot of common techniques between the right hand path and left hand path, but they're not necessarily done for the same reasons.
I was just going to say, breaking taboos is almost a universal aspect of mysticism. I mean, all you have to do is think about things like Tantra, where you have pious Hindus eating beef or consuming wine before having sexual intercourse with someone, usually of a different caste than their own. I mean, these are all very shocking to someone who's very plugged into that culture. And the idea is, no matter what systems you belong to, by breaking those taboos, it's also you're freeing energy that's being bound in a very specific pattern, and now you're not free and you can apply it in different ways.
I just want to say, so basically, the purpose of the lecture was to explain the difference between the true will in the left-hand path and the right-hand path, right? So, the way we all time when Thelema we learn from Crowley, right? The true will of an acorn is to become an oak tree, right?
Right.
There is no choice. So what do you say? We have a choice. We decide which road we want to be. So on what? How do you choose which road you want to be? On your interests, you say, or?
Well, it's a process.
A process.
It's a process, and it evolves over time. Like you have to start off with something. You pick something. You just choose. But then that can change as you go. So it doesn't necessarily have to stay a static goal. As you grow and learn and break down things and enter into that liberation state in between when something's broken down, uh, it changes. You know? So, but you got to start off somewhere. You have to pick something. You know, oftentimes within Thelema, they will. Uh, a lot of times people will not choose until they've reached that point where they are convinced that they've had knowledge and conversation with their holy guardian angel, and then that's when they start working on achieving their will. Um, you know, that's not everybody, you know, but that is a common kind of trap that a lot of times people who are practicing Thelema will fall into. Whereas um, there are insights along the way, you know, and they may be like looking through a glass darkly, you know, but you still get these glimmers, you know, and you just have to decide. You have to pick, you know, you just have to make a choice. I think that's the important part is making that choice.
But do you know anybody, a figure in history who imposed their Luciferian will on the world?
Well, there's the people that have made their mark on the world, um, and you know. Imposing your will upon the world I don't really like that terminology because it implies that you're changing other people or something, right? But you can you can create an influence in the world. You know, you can create something that does exert an influence, you know, and it will change the world. Uh, you know, but it's not necessarily imposing it, you know.
You mean like a person like Carl Jung or somebody?
Well,
Or,
like Galileo or Copernicus, you know, they had these ideas that they believed were true, and but they contradicted. They were even blasphemous, you know, to the ideas that were held as sacred in their society, and they put it out there, you know, and some people rejected it, some people accepted it,
yeah,
you
but
know.
ultimately it was based on science, right?
Yeah, but they had to they had to break free. They had to
You
be
had to
liberated.
break down
Yeah, they had to be liberated from that original idea, that original deeply held belief, in order to get to that realization. To even be able to see it, you have to. They had to get rid of that blockage, you know. And it changed the world, you know. So that's what I
But
think that's an
you always
example.
could say eventually it would have changed the world anyway. I mean,
No, I don't think
more
so.
people would have.
If enough people wanted to believe as they were programmed to believe, you know, and and were fanatical enough about it, then they could enforce a certain level of stasis, you know.
Yeah, but eventually people would have found out the world is not flat. No?
Not if they couldn't see it. You know, if it was suppressed effectively enough, you know, then the idea could maybe didn't wouldn't get out. You know, maybe anybody who, if they were able to suppress the idea enough, and if they were able to support or reinforce the original belief strongly enough, and suppress the new belief strongly enough, then maybe it would never. I think there's probably a lot of things that we've a fallacy that we've been living under for, you know, probably as long as humans have been a species. And who knows, maybe we'll never break free of those fallacies, you know, because they're so deeply ingrained. And the longer it goes on, the more it gets reinforced, because people believe, uh, often people find that they're able to believe something, an idea that's been around longer. It gives it more credibility. It's just part of how we work, how we operate as humans. You know, um, the longer a belief has been around, the more likely we are to think, oh well, people have been believing this for thousands of years. It must be true. Even we even see this in the occult world, where if an esoteric order or a religion that's been around for a lot longer is a lot more well respected, and people aren't thought of as weird for believing in these bizarre beliefs because they've been around for so long. You know? So I think that it is possible that there are fallacies that we've held on to so strongly for so long that we may never break free of them. Okay, well, I think we're ready for Sean's presentation.
Give a moment, I'm telling you, show the fluctuations from my diabetes.
Okay.
I did want to touch upon Will a little bit from what you were saying earlier in the talk, when you were talking about results oriented Will. I think there are certain people out there who just through the force of their personality or their bloody-minded stubbornness, or whatever the case may be, they can just kind of keep to a plan like, this is what I'm doing, this is where I'm going, this is happening, and if you don't agree with me, it's just static and it's just going to roll off my back and I'm going to bulldoze for it. It doesn't always work, but it can work, especially if you have a little bit of luck too. Uh, from more of an occult point of view, though, or if you want to go into esoteric techniques, it brings to mind very classical symbolic ritual magic or demonic magic, where the idea is everything that you arrange if you're doing a ritual, everything that you arrange in that ritual is going to remind you of your intent until it happens. So if you look out in your space where you're working and you place certain items that are all the same color, say fiery red to associate you with fire of Mars because you're working with planet Mars for some kind of war-oriented magic. You're going to see the red and it's going to make you think of your purpose. If you're listening, maybe you've arranged music with like militant type drums, like a march, and again, it's going to bring that purpose back to you. And the idea is that everything that you've arranged in your ritual basically reaffirms what you want to attain. And it's a way of how you were talking about getting that cohesiveness, or Crowley, he defined will as unity of desire. Basically getting all your separate selves, which might be going in all directions, and making that cohesive laser. It's a way of actually doing it through action, where basically every single thing you do, everything you experience for that period of time reaffirms your will.
Yeah.
I kind of thought
Oh,
about
yeah.
that when you were talking.
Exactly. And like the type of incense that you use, everything is supporting that same thing. Now, like we are programmed in a sense by or influenced by everything that we encounter. So that what we do in the ritual chamber is we create a very intensely focused environment and then subject ourselves to it in a sense, and that creates an impact, an influence. We're programming ourselves really to have that kind of intense stubbornness in a specific way. So we can kind of intentionally bring about that state that uh, that will just bulldoze. It creates more momentum in a certain direction. So
Well, the Mr. Gurjeev, he spoke always about remembering yourself being the most important aspect to basically arranging everything you're experiencing for a temporary period of time to reaffirm you of that one desire, of that one wish, or what you've decided for yourself to achieve.
And if you repeat it over and over,
Right.
it amplifies the effect because so that's why we call it a ritual sometimes, is because it's repeated and it's creating it's programming ourselves in a specific way. Yeah, for sure. And that helps recruit the various aspects of ourselves towards achieving coherence and a certain level of integrity in self.
Some philosophers have stated that we all have multiple personalities inside ourselves, and in a way, it's a way of training them so they're all on the same page, so to speak.
Yeah.
Being through this, this experience by yourself, have you been through this process?
Yeah.
And it works.
Yeah, certainly. So now you still have to do the work to achieve your goal, but this gives you an edge.
But we try to think about it and analyze that experience or feeling that you went through. Cannot you see some indicators or triggers, trends? For example, we try not to talk about how you just replace the belief by another belief, right? But you do it willingly.
Right. Yeah, you're doing it specifically,
Exactly.
intentionally,
Right.
for a specific purpose. Yeah.
Exactly. So I've talked to a lot of converts from different religions, right? And going through that, I've seen a lot of things. For example, specific group of Christians convert to specific groups to Muslims, or vice versa. Or specific groups of Muslims who grew up in Europe, for example, under certain circumstances, they convert to Buddhism in certain circumstances. So there's a trend, there's an indicator that telling you, okay, this is why they convert or they change the idea. And of course, there's also some big groups, for example, they turn to atheism from religion. And again, when you go and see, there's always a trend, there's always a trigger or indicator that tells you, there's a tendency to go from this group to that group. And there's a reason why. From that point of view, I'm talking about asking you, don't you see in this journey that you went through that there is another set of social reality that triggers you to go and replace any kind of social reality that you used to be to this new?
Yeah. Well, I think definitely when you are very strongly programmed in a certain way, oftentimes it's not you don't have any control. You have to randomly end up experiencing certain things to break out of it, and it's a random thing. Some people won't ever experience those triggers that will allow them to break out of that. You know? And I think that often that depending on the trigger, it it would determine potentially what they're going to replace it with.
Exactly.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
And but once I think once you've gone through that process enough times, then you can start to realize, oh, I can control this process. I can choose to expose myself to certain influences, like say, for example, in the ritual chamber. You know, um, that will cause certain changes to occur. I can artificially create a situation that will trigger me in a certain way that will bring me to another place. But you have to have gone through that breaking down and that breaking down and rebuilding process enough times to realize it, that you can take the reins yourself. So I think it has to happen randomly at first, but if you have enough self-awareness, then you can start to take the reins of that process and direct it intentionally.
Yeah, but you haven't asked yourself, why did you go through that ritual exactly? Why not something else?
Yeah, I mean, there's a an argument to be made that it's all just random, you know, and that there is no such thing as free will, and that it's all just based off of the various random things that you've encountered, including the things that you've chosen to expose yourself to. You know, you chose them because you're programmed to choose them. You know, but I think that you know, if you go down that rabbit hole too far, then you end up in nihilism. You know, you end up not you end up directionless in just with you you're just gonna be blown whatever direction you're gonna be blown or whatever.
Isn't it true freedom? That's what you go for?
I don't know. Maybe. Maybe if you get to a certain level, yeah, maybe if you get to a certain point where you yeah, maybe.
But then you're not gonna belong to any group.
Right.
Then of course you're not gonna build up this social life. Then of course you're gonna be alienated or weird or stupid or anything you can. You can try to define people and put them in certain frames, right? But that's illusion, right? That's,
Yeah, no, I agree. I think that yeah, probably being in a group or whatever, it's a tool, you know, and if you get too invested, then it becomes a trap in itself. So, um, it's, well, that's I think that part of that is why certain religions have forbidden knowledge, where they'll say, don't expose yourself to this information. It's you're going to put your soul in peril if you expose yourself to this certain information. A lot of times, well, I mean, I know when I was growing up and I was raised Christian. I remember seeing a book on, modern neo-Celtic shamanism, and I looked at it and I was like, and it freaked me out because it was uh, something that it was forbidden knowledge, and it was potentially soul damning, you know, to expose myself to that knowledge. And it required a leap of courage. It required a certain level of courage and a certain level of risk, like I'm risking my soul by even just exposing myself to this knowledge, and but I did it anyways, you know, and I think that's why certain religions have that idea that you're putting your soul in peril by exposing yourself to this other information because they don't want you to break free from that social construct. So it does take a level of courage to kind of break out of, and it can be uncomfortable and it can be fearful, but sometimes you just push through anyway.
Yes, the devil made you do it.
Yeah. I know a lot of people will say I never read the Satanic Bible because they're afraid of what it'll do to them. To read it, just to gain that understanding of the other. Yeah, opening a doorway that allows demons to enter into you. People are afraid of exposing themselves to new information. It's part of how we work. There's a certain level of safety in than the familiar. That, well, I mean, just in terms of survival, people that take risks sometimes don't survive the risk, just in a very practical, mundane sense. And I think over, generations and generations and generations, the sometimes the people that are too willing to take on risks don't survive to propagate their genes. And so we have a genetic predisposition to not taking too much risk. Although on the other side of things, if we don't take a little bit of risk, sometimes that can cause, that's not a winning survival strategy either. You got to have a certain amount of risk, but not too much. And that kind of seems to be the winning combination that our species has kind of developed. And some people have it more than others, and just depends on the luck of the draw.